meaning, something similar to what you see in here, and then you can go into more, hey, this, think about simile, and you spend some time just kind of using that. And a lot of this, because it is so practical nature, this is where you can go and say, okay, let's turn to this passage. And let this become your resource, your major resource, and say, okay, hey, look, when we read this, here's a simile, here's an example for us. Let them read it in the French, you read it in the English, and let that become your sort of a teaching tool. So it's not just you saying, Psalm 51 is blah, 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 parallelism, But you could go in there and say, okay, now here it is in the English, read it in the French, etc., and then explain, hey, here's what this in the Hebrew would sound like or be written like. And so that's important because X, Y, Z. That was important for Hebrew literature and how they communicate. Why do they communicate that? Well, so that for memorization purposes, you got to remember that the Psalms were songs, so they were sung for repetitiveness.
A lot of them are alliterative.
Right.
Well, that's what I was thinking when we were talking about the poetry. It would be a really good idea for us to read it in English, let them hear that. Read it in French, so they can hear it, and hear how in those two translations it doesn't have the rhyme or the meter.
Yeah.
But then also maybe read it or play audio of it in Hebrew, so that okay, now I see how it does that.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful to include some of those kinds of.
Your iPhones work on.
Yeah, I don't know if they would have Hebrew.
Oh, okay. But you get the internet. Do they have Wi-Fi at these places?
The hotel does, but we'll have access to some things.
Okay.
So New Testament genres. You have the Gospels. Gospels are biographies. It deals with the life and ministry of Jesus. So what's a gospel? What's a biography? Thinking about the synoptic versus John's gospel. There are implications of interpretation. Now, forms within the gospel. So what's within them? You have parables. You have miracle stories. You have pronouncement stories. Just like within prophecy, you've got prophecies of disaster, of salvation, prophetic hymns. Within the Gospels, you have parables, you have these miracle stories, you have pronouncement stories. How does that then help me to better interpret gospel literature? What is a parable, and why is that significant to interpreting gospel literature? So it's helping. It's starting from sort of the most basic form and working up towards a bigger, broader category. Does that make sense? Acts, theological history. So Acts, what is Acts? It's giving us the interpretive history from the first century of the church. Naselli gives 9 principles for interpreting gospel and Acts. He says, interpret it as history, discern why they recount the events the way they do, historical and cultural context, read parallel passages, differences and similarities, highlight authors' editorial comments, distinguish between description and prescription, understand what the kingdom of God is. All right, look beyond stories, individual stories, to a series of stories, the whole story of Jesus. Right? So, epistles, there again, there's Naselli, page 29, Revelation, or apocalyptic literature, Naselli, page 31, 6 ideas of apocalyptic literature. Some of this is going to be where there's too much here that we don't necessarily want to communicate. What we don't want to do is create more confusion than needs to be created. We want to have all these ideas right here with us. Doesn't mean we have to communicate all these ideas. It may be that when we come into where it says, understanding the major approaches, all the ways of understanding the material as it's compiled, the compilation or lack thereof, preterist, historical, idealist, futurist, eclectic, compilation, understanding of the book of Revelation, may not necessarily need to be communicated. Hey, there are various approaches to how you can, understand the material of the book of Revelation. And you might give just a couple of those. It's been my experience that sometimes that we can create more of a concern than already existed. Now we want to address issues that arise, and it might be that, you know, with this kind of material, you become a guide in asking questions. Hey, how have you interpreted the book of Revelation? It's very much you can very much take this in a Socratic way and say, asking questions, soliciting response, and then moving from there on what you communicate. Hey, you know, you think about the epistles. How have you interpreted the epistles? You know, asking questions, letting them respond, and then letting that guide what you communicate. Now, if you have all this in front of you, now you know, okay, I need to address something like this. I need to deal with the approaches. And you can communicate that. Well, here's some ways you can approach the book of Revelation. And not necessarily have to just regurgitate but yet listen and then go from there. Yeah. Lesson 5. Textual criticism in translation. What time is Justin coming? 12?
Lesson 4. Oh, you mean for lunch?
Yeah.
We're gonna go to get Subway.
Okay.
Is that okay?
We're going to go together?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Because he bailed on us.
He bailed on us?
No, I mean, no, he didn't bail on us.
Well, he did because he's not here.
No, we had discussed the idea of going to we were gonna talk about it. That he was gonna leave during this thing and go get it. Although I could go get it now.
No.
But I'm gonna stay here.
We can all go to Subway.
Is that fine with everybody?
I like Subway.
Okay. It's not far.
And we're going to stop at noon?
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh?
So
We'll
sorry.
edit that out.
Well, we got that taken care of.
Yeah.
Is Justin coming to lunch?
No.
Okay, good. We're not buying him lunch if he's not here.
So,
Lesson 5.
Lesson 5. Here we go.
What was it?
This made the tape.
I guess we will be editing.
Definitely gonna have that edit out.
Well, yeah.
He could help it. Sick kids.
I'm just kidding.
Sort of.
Lesson 5. Textual criticism in translation.
It's
So,
lesson 4.
lesson 5.
No, we're,
Under rules of
it's
there.
typo.
Oh, you have a typo.
I do. Yeah, there's 2 lesson 4s.
Yeah.
Well, let's get lesson 5 texture.
I do.
Textual criticism and translation. So textual criticism, the idea of arranging the words in the original wording. This is where we're thinking through how we can do this faithfully while not having the totality of Greek text to accomplish it. I think we need to communicate it. I think we need to share it. I think we need to talk about the idea of textual criticism. And what it is and why it's important. And so, establishing the original wording, it's important to ensure proper conclusions. Textual criticism uses all information, records, etc. to try to determine the best possible original autograph writing. So it's taking all the different copies of New Testament. We give you these categories here: Greek manuscripts, ancient translations, New Testament quotations by the church fathers, to try to reconstruct a most faithful autograph of the original New Testament. If you have a New Testament text Bible, you would see that there's tons of numbers and symbols and things that show up, and they're usually somewhere down towards the bottom of the text, and it describes for you the variations that are found within all the thousands of manuscripts that exist that have been brought together to compile the Greek text. Well, textual criticism says, I want to try to find the most faithful original writing, original wording of a particular text. Now, again, that's going to be challenging for us, for them to be able to do that without having to read text. I don't think that means that we just hide from needing to tell them what textual criticism is and how the Greek New Testament came into being for the issue of translation, textual criticism and translation, for the issue of translation, to say, okay, the translation that we're using from the English is the one that's most closely connected word for word to the most faithful understanding of the Greek. And so by that, telling them, hey, there's importance in translation, and letting them see that. I mean, who knows? Maybe somebody who sees there becomes the young man who makes a more faithful translation. You don't know who's sitting there, and what something we communicate could be what God spurs on their heart to desire to do. So textual criticism, just kind of communicating those ideas to them. The idea of variant readings for the different manuscripts. Now, translation, we say you typically want to start with the Greek. That's going to be a challenge, right? I don't think we tell them that we don't do that. I think we tell them that that's what we want to do, and we see what can be produced from there. Go ahead.
The audience that we're speaking to, Cody said something just a minute ago while we were praying about them not being pastors.
Some of them are not.
Some of them are not, some of them are.
Yeah. They're all lay leaders or key ministry leaders within their local churches.
The reason why I was at textual criticism is one of those things that for a young believer will make you doubt your faith.
Sure.
Straight out. And how much do we want to, bring this in?
Right, bring it out. Yeah, I think that's why we're trying to stay very, very top heavy by saying that we can trust what we have because of this.
Over everything else.
Over everything else.
You can't trust a Muslim.
Right, as opposed to trying to say, hey, you know what, there's all these variants, and man, I sure hope we got it right. And what we're saying is, hey, we can trust that what we do have is as faithful a copy as we can get because of good textual criticism. But yes, the majority of the folks that we're training are going to be pastors. Some of them are already talking about church planting, being church planting pastors. But we have some others that are just main key leaders. How they structure some of their ecclesiology, as far as we might call them like lay elders, guys who are sort of help strategically teaching in different groups, helping to lead, are some of the folks that are involved in some of our training. In Ivory Coast, there are some ladies who have come and participated. They weren't by invitation from James, but maybe they're the wife of one of the pastors. I think we have a couple who are members of the church that we're training in. So they're participating in their hearing, but they're not being equipped as female pastors. Good question. So we typically start with the Greek 4 qualities that make a good translation, right? It's accuracy, it's clarity, it's natural, and it's audience appropriate. Both these guys deal with translation in their hermeneutics. And it might be that this might be one of the lessons I take, just simply because of the need to be very careful in what we communicate, how we communicate to them, and just knowing them from over the last little bit of being able to help share this, but just for you guys to have a concept of what we're looking for. Dealing with translation issues, whether it's figurative language, cultural issues, using some of these different ideas to make sure that helping them to see that maybe their translation, while it's the best that they have, needs to also be carefully read through. And so we want to address the issue of translation and address the issue of textual criticism, but we want to make sure that we do it in a way that they would not, one, assume, well, I can't do that because we don't have Greek text and we don't have the ability to read the Greek text. But we also want them to be familiar with some of these ideas. So that would be one of the lessons that I would probably teach while we're there. Yeah? All right. Lesson 6, Greek grammar and phrasing. Now, again, where we're getting into some of those maybe structural issues that would be challenging, given the fact that we don't have the Greek. But I think we need to communicate some of the things, basic ideas of Greek grammar, in order that we can then go on to talking about some other things. So, talking about nouns, verbs. Again, this is probably a lesson that I would teach while we're over there. Analyzing, some of the significant words and phrases. Argument diagramming would be just simply trying to find logical arguments. It might be that I might bring in some Greek ideas and incorporate them and just give them an example of what we're looking at as we're trying to do this.
Does French have perfect tense?
I do not know.
Because that would make it better.
Yeah, make it.
I believe it does. It's much better than
I think every language is better than English.
English is awful.
So anyway, in that lesson here, just to give you guys an idea, what we want to sort of give them a very basic understanding of original language of Greek, while trying to communicate it in a way that they understand without even having the ability to reproduce it regularly. If they have biblical translations, which you can find Bible translations all over the internet, they might be able to get into Greek, a Greek translation. I'm not even sure if they're available online or not. But so if we can give them some basic ideas, then what they can do is they can either use those, begin to use those, or at some point have at least some background should something come into their path, as far as diagramming, as far as basic Greek grammar and phrasing. Now, the same thing working for phrasing can also be done in the English language. We were talking about, I think yesterday a little bit, Cody was talking about how just taking certain ways of the sentences and just breaking them down. And breaking it down in a way that helps you to understand what's the main point, what's being communicated, how it's being communicated, the figures of speech that are in that passage. So these kinds of things can still carry over when you're describing, simple grammar. So that way they can at least unpack sentences in the French in a way that would be faithful. We can give them the tools, and then they can begin to do that. Now, as we're spending each afternoon walking through this is the helpful way to say, okay, let's go to Genesis 11. I want you guys to think about breaking this down. Just basically, because you can't do it in 45 minutes to break the whole thing down. But hey, let's take verses, whatever, the first 3 verses. I want you to get in groups of 2 or 3, and I want you to think through how would you break these sentences down, and how would you phrase them out, or what are the clauses or ideas. If we get them thinking that way, then because what I've seen a lot of times is in cross-cultural communication or cross-cultural ministry, what they do is they take a sentence or a passage and they take one word. And the whole thing's built around that one word. And that one word might be important. It might be the most important word in the passage, but that's not the only thing to preach from that passage. We want to get them thinking sort of in the phrase of how does that word fit into the sentence, and then that sentence fitting into the fuller passage, which gets into the literary context a little bit, but it also has to do with phrasing and getting them to think outside of just one word or a bite-sized piece. So we'll communicate that through thinking about the Greek. I believe that's helpful, but then also using whether it's the English and or the French translations and getting them to be practically thinking through that. How do I take some of these concepts that we could use if we had Greek to apply to what I'm doing with our text? Does that make sense? That's where it really becomes crucial for making sure that we have to communicate that in a way that they would understand. what's lesson 9? More than 9 lessons. There's 10. Okay, let's do one more and then we'll go eat lunch. So number 7. Historical cultural context. Now we're getting back into some specific hermeneutical ideas that I think are much easier to cross the cultures. Biblical passages not only express a writer's train of thought, but also reflect a way of life in one that is drastically different than the current setting. It's not anything we haven't already said, but it's thinking through the biblical writer's train of thought reflects his way of living. It reflects his culture. It reflects his historical setting. And that's drastically different than the current setting. Now, there are probably greater similarities culturally to first century Judaism and Christianity to maybe some West African culture or even some Southeast Asian cultures and South American cultures in our Western culture. You know, whether it's some of the agrarian, the society, the way things function is maybe more similar in their culture to what we find here than in ours.
So I know you said earlier, like one of the ways you've seen, like going back to that, was like guys using examples of like retirement and other things that they're just not going to get. What would be other ways that you've seen that would be like negative ways of going towards that, and maybe like positive ways of like trying to cross
that? Well, I think if you're familiar with sort of the farming or agricultural life of guys here, you couldn't talk about the idea of using big tractors to plant fields, but the idea of tilling the ground and planting the seed and watering the seed and those kind of things, that's a lot of the imagery that Jesus uses in the New Testament. So if you even have the concept or of ranching or cattle farming, shepherding, it's having some of those mind pictures of maybe what that would look like, and then being able to communicate that because that's what they're going to understand.
Using their day-to-day life.
Using their day-to-day life